I didn't mean to find out that way. Not through a machine that was supposed to make our lives easier. Not through a voice assistant sitting quietly on the kitchen counter like it hadn't been listening all along. Like it hadn't been collecting fragments of our lives and storing them somewhere cold and permanent. But that's exactly how it happened, and sometimes I think that makes it worse. Because betrayal is one thing when it comes from a person, but when it's revealed by something inhuman, something passive, it feels like the truth has been waiting for you, patient and inevitable, just out of sight. It started with something small, something stupid. Like most disasters do, I was trying to check a reminder I thought I had set earlier in the week, something about a meeting, and I couldn't find it on my phone. So I asked Alexa to pull up recent voice activity, a feature I barely even knew existed until that moment, and I remember feeling mildly annoyed, distracted, completely unaware that I was seconds away from stepping into a version of my life I didn't recognize. The recordings appeared one after another, timestamps lined up neatly, ordinary commands at first, weather updates, grocery lists, music requests, the dull rhythm of everyday life. And then I heard my own voice, casual, tired, asking about dinner options, and I almost stopped there because nothing seemed out of place, but something made me keep going, maybe instinct. Maybe boredom, maybe something deeper that I still can't fully explain. And then I heard a voice, my wife's voice. Soft, but not the way she sounded with me. There was a difference I couldn't immediately name. Something lighter, something unguarded. And she wasn't talking to Alexa. Not really. She was speaking in the room, and the device had just happened to catch it. Like an accidental witness that didn't know what it was recording. And at first I didn't understand what I was hearing, because context matters, tone matters, and without seeing her, without being there, it felt like trying to piece together a conversation through a wall, but then another voice joined, a man's voice, unfamiliar, low and comfortable in a way that made my chest tighten instantly. And I froze, my hand hovering over the screen as if stopping it would undo what I had already heard. But I didn't stop it. I couldn't, because some part of me already knew. They were laughing, quietly, the kind of laughter people share when they don't want to be overheard. And then she said his name, not mine, never mine, and something inside me shifted. Something heavy and irreversible, and I told myself there had to be an explanation. There is always an explanation. Maybe a friend, maybe a coworker, maybe something harmless twisted by the lack of context. But explanations started collapsing one by one as the recording continued, as their voices moved closer together, as words blurred into something unmistakable, something intimate in a way that didn't belong in my home, didn't belong in the life I thought we shared. I replayed it 3 times, each time hoping I had misunderstood, each time catching new details I had missed before, the way she spoke more freely than she had with me in years, the way he responded like he knew her deeply, like he belonged there, like I was the outsider in my own house. My first reaction wasn't anger, not immediately, it was confusion, a disorienting, hollow kind of confusion that made everything feel slightly unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's memory, and I sat there staring at the device as if it might explain itself. As if it might apologize, as if it might say there had been some kind of mistake. But there was no mistake. Only more recordings, more fragments, more evidence scattered across days and weeks I had lived through without noticing anything wrong. And that was the part that hurt the most. Not just that it was happening, but that it had been happening quietly, consistently, right in front of me, hidden in plain sight while I moved through my routines believing everything was normal. I scrolled further back, my breathing uneven now, my mind racing ahead of the evidence, and every clip I opened felt like another door closing behind me. Another confirmation that what I was hearing wasn't isolated, wasn't accidental. It was a pattern, a second life unfolding in the spaces I wasn't paying attention to. There was one recording that stayed with me more than the others, one that I wish I could forget but can't, because in it, she said my name. And for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, this was where things would make sense, but the way she said it wasn't loving, wasn't even neutral, it was distant, almost dismissive. Like I was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. And the man responded with something I couldn't fully hear, but I didn't need to, because the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. I don't remember how long I sat there after that, just staring at the screen, the room around me, suddenly unfamiliar, like the walls had shifted slightly while I wasn't looking. Like the life I thought I understood had quietly rearranged itself into something else entirely, and I realized then that the discovery wasn't just about her, it was about me too. About the version of myself who hadn't seen it, who hadn't questioned the late nights, the subtle distance, the small changes that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. When she came home that evening, everything felt different, even the way she opened the door, even the way she said hello, and I watched her carefully. searching for the woman I thought I knew, and finding instead someone I was only just beginning to understand, someone who had been living alongside me, but not entirely with me, and she smiled, asked about my day, moved through the kitchen like nothing had changed, like the recordings didn't exist, like the truth wasn't sitting quietly inside a device just a few feet away. I didn't confront her right away, not because I didn't want answers, but because I suddenly understood something I hadn't before, that once something is said out loud, it can't be taken back. And I wasn't ready yet to hear her version of the truth, wasn't ready to see how she would explain it, deny it, or maybe even justify it, and instead I carried the knowledge with me, heavy and sharp. As I sat across from her at dinner, as I listened to her talk about ordinary things, as I nodded at the right moments, playing my part in a life that no longer felt real. That night, lying beside her in the dark, I listened to her breathing, steady and calm, and I wondered how long she had been able to sleep like that. How long she had been able to exist in two realities at once, and I realized that the hardest part wasn't what I had heard, it was what I hadn't, all the moments the device hadn't recorded, all the conversations that existed only between them, unseen and untraceable, and I understood then that what I had found wasn't the full truth, it was only the beginning of it. And the rest was still out there, waiting for me to decide whether I was strong enough to uncover it. The next morning I woke up before her, though I hadn't really slept, just drifted in and out of a restless awareness where every sound felt amplified, every movement beside me too deliberate, as if my body already knew something. My mind was still trying to process, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, realizing that nothing had physically changed, and yet everything had. And that was the strangest part, how betrayal doesn't announce itself with visible destruction. How it can exist fully formed beneath the surface of an ordinary life. She shifted beside me eventually, stretching slightly before sitting up, and I kept my eyes closed for a moment longer, pretending to still be asleep, because I wanted to observe her without being observed, to see if there was any sign, any subtle difference in the way she moved, the way she carried herself. But she seemed the same, or maybe she had always been this way and I had simply never noticed, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else. When I finally got up, she was already in the kitchen, asking Alexa about the weather in that same familiar tone, and for a brief second I felt a surge of anger so sharp it caught me off guard, because that device, that quiet witness, now felt like it knew more about my marriage than I did, like it had been present for truths I had been excluded from, and I wondered how many other moments it had captured, how many pieces of my life were stored somewhere I had never thought to look. I forced myself to stay calm, to move through the morning as usual, because reacting too quickly would only close doors I hadn't even opened yet, and I needed those doors. Needed access to whatever else had been hidden from me, so I drank my coffee, nodded at her comments, even smiled once or twice, and the entire time I felt like I was watching myself from a distance, like I had split into two versions, one living the moment and the other analyzing it, searching for meaning in every word, every glance. After she left for work, I returned to the Alexa app immediately, my fingers moving faster now, more certain, and I began to dig deeper, not just into recent recordings, but further back, weeks, months, anything I could access, and what I found wasn't always clear, not always explicit, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that what I had heard wasn't isolated, wasn't a misunderstanding. It was part of something ongoing, something deliberate, and the more I listened, the more patterns emerged. Times of day when recordings would spike. Moments when her voice would lower, when another presence would enter the background, and even when words weren't fully captured, the tone told its own story. I started writing things down, timestamps, phrases, anything that might help me build a timeline, and as I did, I realized I was no longer just a husband trying to understand his wife. I had become something else entirely, an observer, an investigator, someone trying to reconstruct a truth that had been hidden in fragments, and that realization made me uneasy, because it meant the relationship I thought I had was already gone, replaced by something colder, more calculated. Around midday, I found a recording that changed everything again, not because it revealed something entirely new, but because it provided context, clarity in a way the others hadn't, and in it, she wasn't just speaking casually, she was planning, discussing times, coordinating, her voice focused and intentional. And the man responded with familiarity that suggested this had been happening for far longer than I had dared to assume. And when she mentioned a day I clearly remembered, a day I had been home early, a day I had sat just one room away, unaware of what was unfolding, I felt something inside me collapse completely, because that meant the distance between truth and illusion had been far smaller than I ever imagined. That I hadn't just missed the signs, I had lived alongside them. I stopped the recording halfway through, unable to listen further, and sat back in silence, the weight of everything settling in a way that felt heavier now, more real, and I realized I couldn't stay passive any longer. Couldn't just collect pieces without deciding what to do with them, because knowledge without action becomes its own kind of prison. But confrontation still felt premature, not because I doubted what I had found, but because I needed to understand more, needed to know who he was, how long this had been happening, and most importantly, why, not in the simple sense of betrayal, but in the deeper sense of what had changed, what had broken, what I had missed or ignored or failed to see. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I left work early without telling her, not because I expected to catch her in the act, but because I wanted to feel the house again, to experience it differently, knowing what I now knew. And when I walked through the door, the silence felt different, heavier, like it was holding on to secrets even in her absence. And I stood there for a long moment, looking around at the space we had built together, wondering how much of it had been real and how much of it had been performance. My eyes drifted to the Alexa device on the counter, its small light off, unassuming, and I found myself wondering how something so simple could carry so much weight, how it had become the unexpected witness to the unraveling of my marriage. And for a brief moment, I considered unplugging it, erasing everything, choosing ignorance over clarity. But I knew I couldn't do that, not anymore, because once you hear the truth, even in fragments, you can't return to the version of yourself who didn't know. When she came home that evening, I was already there, sitting in the living room, and she seemed slightly surprised, just for a second, before covering it with a smile, and I noticed that now, the small reactions I had once overlooked stood out clearly, like signals I could finally interpret, and we went through the motions again: dinner, conversation, the quiet routine of a shared life. But beneath it, something had shifted permanently, something that neither of us acknowledged but both of us in different ways could feel. That night, as she slept beside me again, I made a decision not about confrontation, not yet, but about direction, because I understood now that this wasn't just about catching her. It was about understanding the full truth, and I wasn't going to rely on accidental recordings anymore. I was going to find the rest of it myself, no matter what it took. The first step was figuring out who he was, because a voice, no matter how familiar it starts to sound after repeated listening, is still just a shadow without a name. And I needed more than shadows now. I needed something solid, something undeniable, something that would transform suspicion into certainty in a way that couldn't be explained away or softened by excuses. I began with what I had: the recordings, replaying them not as a husband this time, but as someone searching for patterns, for clues hidden in the ordinary, and slowly, details started to surface. Small things I had overlooked before. The way he mentioned locations casually, the way she referenced times that aligned with her supposed errands or late meetings, and piece by piece, a map began forming in my mind, not perfect, not complete, but enough to guide me forward. There was one name she had said only once, quickly, almost carelessly, but it stood out now like a crack in glass, something that couldn't be unseen, and I held on to it, repeating it quietly to myself, as if saying it enough times would make it more real, more tangible. I checked her social media first, not because I expected to find anything obvious, but because sometimes people reveal more than they intend through small interactions, likes, comments, connections that seem meaningless until you're looking for them, and it didn't take long before I found it, the name again, attached to a profile that felt both ordinary and intrusive at the same time, a man who looked unremarkable in every way except for the fact that he existed in a space that overlapped with hers, someone who had no place in my life, and yet had somehow become part of it. I stared at his photo longer than I should have, searching for something that would explain it, something that would make sense of why him, why this person, but there was nothing obvious, nothing that justified the quiet collapse of everything I thought I understood. From there, things moved faster than I expected, because once you start looking, connections begin to reveal themselves, and I saw how often they interacted, how naturally their online presence intertwined, subtle enough to avoid attention at a glance, but undeniable once you knew where to look, and I felt a strange detachment settling over me, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold rather than my own, as if this discovery belonged to another version of me who hadn't yet caught up to the reality of it. But knowing his name wasn't enough, knowing his face wasn't enough, because what I needed to understand now was how far it had gone, how deeply it had embedded itself into the structure of my life. And that required more than observation, it required action. The idea came to me slowly, forming in the quiet space between thought and decision, and once it was there, I couldn't ignore it, because it felt inevitable, like the next step in something I had already started without fully realizing it. I began to follow her routine more closely, not in an obvious way, not in a way that would alert her, but in small adjustments, leaving work at different times, taking different routes, placing myself in positions where I could observe without being seen, and the first few attempts revealed nothing, just ordinary movements. Familiar patterns that almost made me question everything again, almost made me wonder if I had built something larger in my mind than what actually existed. But doubt didn't last, because truth, once uncovered, has a way of insisting on itself. And a few days later, I saw it, not through a recording, not through a screen, but with my own eyes. And somehow that made it both clearer and harder to accept at the same time. She was standing outside a cafe I knew well, one we had been to together countless times, a place that had once held shared memories, and now she stood there with him. The man whose voice I had memorized without ever meeting, and they were close, closer than strangers, closer than colleagues. Their body language effortless and familiar in a way that doesn't happen by accident, and I stayed where I was, watching from a distance, my chest tight but my mind strangely calm. Because there it was, the truth in its most undeniable form, no longer hidden in fragments or recordings, no longer something I had to piece together, just real and present and impossible to ignore. They didn't notice me, and for a moment, I wondered what would happen if I walked up to them, if I stepped directly into that scene and forced it into the open, but something held me back. Something that understood that this moment, as painful as it was also valuable, because it confirmed everything, without giving anything away, and I needed that advantage, needed the time to decide what came next without losing control of the situation. I watched them a little longer than I should have, long enough to see the way she smiled at him, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years, long enough to understand that whatever existed between them wasn't new, wasn't casual, it was established, comfortable, something that had grown quietly while I remained unaware. When I finally turned away, walking back to my car, I felt the weight of it settle differently inside me, not as confusion anymore, not even as shock, but as something more defined, more focused, a clarity that replaced uncertainty with purpose, because now I knew, completely and without doubt, and knowing changes everything. That night, when she came home and greeted me the same way she always did, I responded the same way I always had, but inside, something had shifted permanently. Because I was no longer trying to figure out if it was happening, I was deciding what to do about it, and for the first time since I had heard that first recording, I felt something stronger than confusion or pain, something steady and deliberate, the beginning of a plan. I didn't confront her the night I saw them, or the night after, or even the week that followed, because by then I understood something I hadn't before. That confrontation isn't power, not when it's driven by emotion alone. Not when it gives the other person time to reshape the narrative, to deny, to manipulate, to regain control of a situation they've already distorted. And I wasn't interested in arguments anymore. I was interested in truth, in clarity, in ending something that had already been broken long before I discovered it. Instead, I prepared, quietly and deliberately, the same way I had once listened to those recordings, the same way I had followed her without being seen, and I gathered everything, not just the evidence from Alexa. Not just the recordings that had first opened my eyes, but the patterns, the timelines, the confirmations I had witnessed with my own eyes. And I placed it all together into something solid, something undeniable, something that didn't rely on emotion to make its point. The day I chose wasn't accidental. It was a Saturday, calm and ordinary, the kind of day where nothing feels urgent, where routines settle into something predictable. And she was in the living room when I called her into the kitchen, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, and she came without hesitation, without suspicion. Because why would she suspect anything? I had given her no reason to. I had played my role perfectly, and that realization stayed with me. How easily trust can be maintained even after it has been broken. How appearances can carry a lie longer than truth ever could. I had already placed the Alexa device on the table, along with my phone, the recordings ready, the timeline clear in my mind. And when she saw them, something shifted in her expression instantly. Not fear at first, but recognition, the kind that comes when a hidden truth suddenly finds itself exposed. And she asked what this was, her voice controlled but thinner than usual. And I didn't answer immediately, because I wanted her to feel the silence, to understand that something had changed before a single word was spoken. Then I played the first recording, the one that had started everything, and the sound filled the room in a way that felt almost unnatural, like it didn't belong in the open air, like it had been meant to stay hidden, and she stood there listening, her face slowly losing its composure as recognition turned into something heavier, something she couldn't dismiss or redirect. I didn't stop it, didn't interrupt, didn't explain. I just let it play, and when it ended, I played another and another, each one building on the last. Each one removing another layer of denial until there was nothing left to hide behind, and by the time I stopped, the silence in the room felt completely different, no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, but final. She tried to speak then, tried to explain, to reshape what had already been made clear, saying things about loneliness, about distance, about how we had both changed over time. And maybe some of it was true. Maybe there were things we had both ignored, things we had both allowed to fade, but none of that changed what she had done. None of that changed the fact that she had chosen secrecy over honesty, had built something parallel instead of confronting what was broken. And I listened without interrupting, not because I needed her explanation, but because I wanted her to finish, to reach the end of whatever version of the story she was trying to construct. When she finally stopped, I told her I had seen them, not in anger, not as an accusation, just as a fact, and that was the moment everything shifted completely. Because there is something about being seen, truly seen, that removes any remaining illusion, and her expression changed in a way I hadn't seen before, the last pieces of defense falling away as she realized there was nothing left to deny. She asked what I wanted to do, and for a moment, I considered the weight of that question, how different my answer might have been a week ago, how I might have reacted with anger or desperation, or some attempt to fix what had already been lost. But standing there now, I felt something else entirely, something calmer, clearer, and I realized that the decision had already been made long before this moment, long before the recordings, long before the cafe. It had been made the moment the truth stopped being something I feared and became something I accepted. I told her I was leaving, not as a threat, not as a reaction, but as a conclusion, and she didn't argue the way I expected, didn't try to stop me in the dramatic ways people imagine. Because I think she understood then, just as I did, that this wasn't a sudden decision, it was the result of something that had been unfolding quietly for a long time. The process that followed wasn't loud or chaotic. It was measured, almost quiet, the separation of two lives that had already begun to drift apart long before either of us acknowledged it. And while there were difficult moments, conversations that carried the weight of what we had lost, there was also a strange sense of clarity, as if removing the illusion allowed something more honest to exist in its place, even if that honesty meant ending what we once believed would last. The last time I interacted with the Alexa device, I opened the voice history one final time, scrolling through the recordings that had once felt like fragments of something hidden, and now felt like the beginning of something else entirely, because without them, I might have continued living in that quiet uncertainty, might have ignored the subtle shifts until they became something impossible to escape. And I realized then that truth doesn't always arrive the way you expect. Sometimes it comes through ordinary things, through devices and moments you barely notice, and when it does, it doesn't just reveal what's been hidden, it forces you to decide what you're going to do with it. I deleted the recordings after that. Not out of denial, not to erase what had happened, but because I no longer needed them. The truth had already done its work. And as I unplugged the device and set it aside, the house felt different, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound, and everything to do with clarity. And for the first time since this all began, I understood that what I had lost was not just a relationship, but an illusion. And while losing it hurt, there was also something freeing in finally seeing things as they truly were.